Here's what makes Abraham Lincoln's leadership during the American Civil War one of the most extraordinary stories in history. He wasn't supposed to win. By every measure, military experience, battlefield knowledge, strategic training, he was the wrong man for the job. He'd never commanded troops in a real war. His only military service was a brief stint in the Illinois militia during the Black Hawk War of 1832, where he saw no combat and later joked that his only battles were against mosquitoes. Yet this self-taught frontier lawyer would orchestrate the defeat of some of America's finest military minds, holding together a fracturing nation through the deadliest conflict in American history. The Civil War killed more Americans than World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. Between 1861 and 1865, approximately 620,000 soldiers died, roughly 2% of the entire American population. If the same percentage died today, it would equal 6.5 million deaths. Imagine that scale of loss. Now imagine you're the person making the decisions that cause it, knowing that every order you sign will result in letters delivered to farmhouses announcing that someone's son, husband, or father is dead. This is the story of how a civilian president learned to wage total war, how he transformed a limited conflict into a revolution, and why his political decisions, not battlefield tactics, determined the war's outcome. It's about the relationship between political will and military force, about how wars are won not just on battlefields, but in the minds of citizens and soldiers who must believe the cause is worth the cost. And it's about one man's realization that to save the country, he would first have to transform it, and that transformation would require rivers of blood. The war began because of a question America had avoided since its founding. Could a nation conceived in liberty continue to exist half slave and half free? By 1860, the answer was becoming clear. It couldn't. The election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency on an explicitly anti-slavery expansion platform triggered immediate crisis. Lincoln hadn't even taken office when South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860, followed rapidly by 6 more Deep South states. They formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis, a West Point graduate and former Secretary of War, as their president. The contrast was stark. The Confederacy had chosen a man with impeccable military credentials to lead them through what they knew would be an armed conflict. The Union had a lawyer who'd spent most of his career riding the judicial circuit in rural Illinois. When Lincoln took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, 7 states had already left the Union. In his inaugural address, he tried to thread an impossible needle, reassuring the South that he wouldn't interfere with slavery where it existed, while insisting that secession was illegal and the Union was perpetual. "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war," he said. But his hands would be the ones that waged it. The crisis came to a head at Fort Sumter, a federal installation in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The fort's garrison of 85 soldiers, commanded by Major Robert Anderson, was running out of supplies. Lincoln faced his first test: resupply the fort and risk war, or abandon it and acknowledge Confederate independence. He chose a middle path, announcing he would send supplies but not reinforcements, putting the decision to fire first on the Confederacy. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire. For 34 hours, shells rained on Fort Sumter. When Anderson finally surrendered on April 13th, the garrison marching out with honors of war, both sides believed this would be the conflict's extent, a symbolic confrontation perhaps, followed by a negotiation. They were catastrophically wrong. On April 15th, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days to suppress the rebellion. 90 days! That's how long his advisors believed would be necessary. The call for troops had an immediate and disastrous effect. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina seceded rather than provide soldiers to fight against their southern neighbors. Most devastating was Virginia's secession, which brought with it Colonel Robert E. Lee, perhaps America's finest military officer, who declined Lincoln's offer to command Union forces and resigned his commission to fight for his home state. Here's why Lincoln's role becomes crucial at this moment. He had to make a fundamental decision about what kind of war this would be. Would it be a limited war to restore the Union, accepting slavery's continuation to keep border states like Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri loyal? Or would it be a revolutionary war to end slavery, risking those border states but gaining moral ground and international support? Lincoln initially chose the former, believing that preserving the Union was the paramount goal and that moving too quickly against slavery would fracture his coalition. But he was also calculating something his generals didn't see: the relationship between war aims and political sustainability. A war just to force southern states back into a union they didn't want to be part of would eventually lose northern support. People would ask why their sons should die just to restore the status quo. But a war to end slavery, to fulfill America's founding promise that all men are created equal, that was a cause that could sustain sacrifice. Lincoln understood that military strategy and political purpose were inseparable. His genius wasn't military, it was political vision applied to military ends. The war's first major battle demonstrated how unprepared both sides were. On July 21, 1861, two amateur armies collided near a creek called Bull Run in northern Virginia. Congressmen and societies rode out from Washington with picnic baskets to watch what they assumed would be an entertaining Union victory. Instead, they witnessed chaos. For most of the day, Union forces actually pushed Confederate troops back. Then Confederate reinforcements arrived by railroad, the first time in history that rail transport had strategically decided a battle, and a Virginia brigade under General Thomas J. Jackson held a defensive position so stubbornly that another general, rallying his troops, shouted, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall." The Union advance turned into a panicked rout, soldiers streaming back to Washington, not stopping until they reached the Capitol itself. Lincoln received the news late that night. It wouldn't be over in 90 days. It wouldn't be over in a year. The next day, while Washington feared Confederate armies might march directly on the Capitol, Lincoln signed bills calling for 500,000 three-year volunteers and authorizing massive military expenditures. If this would be a long war, he would wage it. His role was becoming clear. He would provide the political will and strategic direction that would allow military force to succeed. But Lincoln faced a problem that would plague him for 3 years. His generals wouldn't fight the kind of war he needed. He appointed General McClellan to command the Army of the Potomac, and McClellan was brilliant at organizing, training, and inspiring troops. Soldiers loved Little Mac. There was just one problem: he wouldn't fight. He drilled endlessly, demanded more troops and supplies, consistently overestimated Confederate strength, and found reasons to delay every offensive. Lincoln grew increasingly frustrated. When McClellan complained his horses were tired, Lincoln sent him a tersely sarcastic telegram. "Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigues anything?" Here is where Lincoln's unique role becomes visible. He wasn't a military strategist, but he understood strategic logic better than most of his generals. He recognized that the Union's advantages, larger population, more industry, control of the Navy, only mattered if they were brought to bear relentlessly. The Confederacy didn't need to conquer the North. It only needed to defend itself long enough for Northern will to collapse. Every month the war dragged on without decisive Union victory made Northern peace sentiment stronger. Lincoln needed generals who would maintain constant pressure, who would trade casualties for progress, who understood that this was a war of attrition that the Union could win if it simply refused to quit. He found one such general in the West, Ulysses S. Grant, initially considered a drunk and a failure. In February 1862, Grant captured Fort Donelson in Tennessee, taking nearly 15,000 Confederate prisoners. When the Confederate commander asked for terms, Grant replied, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." Here was a general who thought like Lincoln, willing to fight, willing to accept costs to achieve objectives. Lincoln took notice, but he couldn't yet bring Grant east because political considerations required him to work with more established generals.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Meanwhile, McClellan's massive Peninsula campaign in spring 1862 came tantalizingly close to capturing Richmond before new Confederate commander Robert E. Lee drove the Union Army back in the 7 Days Battles. Then, Lee destroyed another Union Army at Second Bull Run in August 1862 and invaded Maryland, hoping to win a victory on Northern soil that might bring European recognition of Confederate independence and break Northern will. The two armies collided on September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. The battle became the single bloodiest day in American history. 22,717 casualties in 12 hours. The fighting was apocalyptic. Entire regiments cut down in cornfields that changed hands 15 times. A sunken road filled with Confederate dead piled 3 and 4 deep. Desperate struggles for control of a stone bridge. When night fell, Lee's invasion had been stopped, though at terrible cost. Technically, the Union could claim victory, the first significant one in the Eastern Theater, and Lincoln had been waiting for exactly this moment. 5 days after Antietam, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in states still in rebellion would be then, thenceforward, and forever free. This was Lincoln's most important political decision of the war, and it reveals why his civilian leadership was more crucial than any battlefield command could be. He was redefining what the war meant. The proclamation was carefully crafted political genius. It applied only to states in rebellion, which meant it didn't immediately free anyone. Union-controlled areas and loyal border states still had slavery. Critics then and now have called it a cynical half-measure, but Lincoln understood exactly what he was doing. First, he was making compromise impossible. If the war was about slavery and human freedom, only total victory or total defeat could end it. Second, he was inviting enslaved people to undermine the Confederacy from within. Every Union advance would now be met by enslaved people fleeing to freedom, depriving the South of its labor force. Third, he was making European recognition of the Confederacy politically impossible. Britain and France, facing their own abolitionist movements, couldn't support a nation explicitly fighting to preserve slavery. Most importantly, Lincoln was transforming the war's political meaning. A war just to force states back into the Union was hard to sustain. People would ask why their sons should die for that. But a war to end slavery, to fulfill America's founding promise, to prove that government of, by, and for the people could survive, that was a cause that could justify almost any sacrifice. This is why Lincoln's role was decisive. He provided the political vision that made military victory possible. The proclamation took effect on January 1, 1863, and thousands of enslaved people began fleeing to Union lines. Lincoln authorized African-American regiments, and by war's end, roughly 80,000 black men would serve in the Union Army, nearly 10% of Union forces. They fought with particular ferocity, knowing that capture meant execution or re-enslavement rather than prisoners of war camps. Each black soldier was a double blow to the Confederacy, one more Union soldier, one less Confederate laborer. But transforming the war's meaning didn't make winning it easier. In December 1862, General Ambrose Burnside ordered suicidal attacks at entrenched Confederate positions at Fredericksburg, resulting in 12,000 Union casualties and accomplishing nothing. When news reached Washington, Lincoln was devastated. "If there is worse place than hell, I am in it." The defeat triggered a political crisis. Republicans in Congress demanded cabinet changes, moderates questioned Lincoln's competence, Democrats called for peace. For a moment, Lincoln's government seemed ready to collapse from within. But Lincoln did what he always did. He listened, calculated, and persevered. He met with senators, defended his cabinet, and held his government together through sheer political skill. This is easily overlooked in military histories, but it was absolutely essential. Lincoln had to maintain political support for the war while the armies kept losing. He had to convince Congress to keep appropriating money, governors to keep sending troops, and citizens to keep believing victory was possible. This required political leadership of the highest order, managing fractious Republicans, countering Democrat opposition, navigating cabinet rivalries, dealing with military failures, all while making life-and-death decisions about strategy and command. By mid-1863, the war reached its turning point, not through a single battle, but through Lincoln's strategic clarity finally being executed by capable generals. In the West, Grant's relentless campaign culminated in the capture of Vicksburg, Mississippi on July 4, 1863, giving the Union complete control of the Mississippi River and cutting the Confederacy in half. On the exact same day, Lee's second invasion of the North was defeated at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, after 3 days of desperate fighting that cost 51,000 casualties. Lee would never again have the strength to threaten Northern territory. Lincoln understood Gettysburg's significance, though he was frustrated that Meade didn't pursue and destroy Lee's wounded army. In November 1863, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg for the dedication of a national cemetery on the battlefield. In 276 words, a 2-minute speech that most people in the crowd probably couldn't hear clearly, Lincoln delivered what became one of the most important texts in American history. The Gettysburg Address made explicit what Lincoln had been working toward. This war was about whether democracy itself could survive and whether the American promise of equality could be made real. Every soldier who died had died to make America live up to its founding ideals. It was stunning rhetoric that gave meaning to mass death, reframing sacrifice as service towards a transcendent purpose. But the war ground on, and 1864 brought Lincoln's greatest crisis. In March, he promoted Grant to command all Union armies. Grant understood the war the way Lincoln did, as a matter of resources and will. His strategy was simultaneous advances on all fronts, giving the Confederacy no rest. In Virginia, Grant accompanied the Army of the Potomac and directed operations against Lee. In Georgia, William Tecumseh Sherman drove towards Atlanta. Everywhere, Union forces would maintain relentless pressure. The Virginia campaign was brutal. From May through June 1864, Grant and Lee fought nearly continuously. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. Union casualties exceeded 65,000. After Cold Harbor, where Grant ordered a disastrous frontal assault that cost 7,000 in less than an hour, he later wrote it was the only attack he wished he'd never ordered. But, unlike previous Union commanders, Grant didn't retreat after defeats. He maneuvered, eventually besieging Petersburg, the rail hub supplying Richmond. Lee's army was pinned in place, growing weaker every day. But in Washington, Lincoln faced potential political defeat. The 1864 election was approaching, and war news seemed terrible. Grant's casualties were staggering. Richmond hadn't fallen. Sherman seemed bogged down outside Atlanta. Democrats nominated McClellan for president on a platform calling the war a failure and advocating peace negotiations. In August, Lincoln wrote a memo predicting his own defeat. "It will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he can possibly not save it afterwards." Lincoln believed he would lose, and he believed McClellan's election would mean Confederate independence. Everything, all the deaths, all the sacrifice, would be meaningless. This is the moment that reveals Lincoln's role most clearly. He had provided the political will to continue fighting when every rational calculation suggested giving up. Now that will might collapse, and with it, the Union cause. Then Sherman captured Atlanta on September 2, 1864. The news electrified the North. Suddenly, victory seemed possible again. Lincoln's political fortunes reversed overnight. In November, he won re-election decisively, carrying all but 3 states and winning 78% of soldiers' votes. The men actually fighting the war had voted to continue. The election was a referendum on the war itself, and the North had voted to see it through. Sherman didn't rest after Atlanta. He cut his army loose from supply lines and marched through Georgia to Savannah, destroying everything of military value along a 60-mile-wide path. This was total war, making the civilian population feel war's hard hand, destroying not just armies, but the economic capacity and psychological will to continue fighting. When Sherman reached Savannah in December, he telegraphed Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." Sherman then turned north into South Carolina, eager to punish the state that started the war. His soldiers burned Columbia, the state capital, and destroyed virtually everything in their path. Meanwhile, Grant maintained relentless pressure on Lee's shrinking army. In early April 1865, Grant finally broke through at Petersburg. Lee evacuated Richmond and tried to escape west, hoping to join Confederate forces in North Carolina. But Union forces pursued and blocked his path. On April 9, 1865, Lee met Grant in a farmhouse at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and surrendered. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers would be paroled and allowed to go home, could keep their horses for spring planting, and officers could keep their sidearms. When Lee mentioned his men were starving, Grant immediately ordered rations sent to Confederate lines. It was over. 4 years, 620,000 dead, hundreds of thousands more maimed, and the Union preserved. Abraham Lincoln had done what no one thought possible. He had held the nation together through its darkest hour by providing political vision when military solutions failed, by articulating purposes that made sacrifice meaningful, by finding generals capable of victory and giving them the support to win, and by maintaining political will when every sign suggested giving up. His role was decisive precisely because he wasn't a military commander. He was a political leader who understood that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of citizens who must believe the cause justifies the cost. He had 5 days to savor the victory. On April 14, 1865, Good Friday, John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in the back of the head at Ford's Theater. Lincoln died the next morning at 7:22 a.m. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War demonstrates something profound about how wars are actually won. It wasn't military genius that saved the Union. It was political will, strategic clarity, and moral vision. Lincoln understood that the war required mobilizing resources, maintaining political support, articulating purposes that made sacrifice meaningful, and persevering when every rational calculation suggested giving up. He transformed a limited war into a total war, a political crisis into a moral crusade, a rebellion into a revolution. He found generals capable of victory not by choosing the most educated, but by choosing those whose temperament matched the war he needed to win, brutal, relentless, willing to accept terrible costs. His greatest achievement wasn't holding the nation together or freeing the enslaved, though he did both. It was redefining what America meant, expanding the Declaration's promise that all men are created equal from aspiration to constitutional reality. The war ended slavery through the 13th Amendment, passed just before Lincoln's death. The 14th Amendment followed, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection. The 15th guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. These weren't inevitable. They were choices Lincoln and Congress made about what nation would emerge from the carnage. The cost was almost incomprehensible. 620,000 dead, economies shattered, a landscape scarred by war, a generation lost. Was it worth it? That depends on whether you believe ending slavery and preserving democratic government justified such sacrifice. Lincoln himself seemed to wrestle with this question. In his second inaugural address, delivered weeks before his death, he didn't celebrate impending victory. Instead, he reflected on the war as divine punishment visited upon the entire nation for slavery's sin. Then he called for reconciliation, with malice to none, with charity for all. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. That's the Lincoln history remembers, the one who saved the Union and freed the enslaved while bearing the war's costs personally and calling for reconciliation after terrible bloodshed. But he also made the decisions that caused the bloodshed, choosing war over disunion, total victory over negotiated settlement, continuing to fight when costs became almost unbearable. Both things are true simultaneously. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Lincoln's Civil War leadership was simply that he endured. He absorbed defeats, casualties, political attacks, and personal grief, and he continued. He signed orders sending men to die, knowing what he was doing, and bore that weight. And when victory came, he immediately began to heal rather than exact revenge. That's the leader the crisis produced, not perfect, but adequate to the moment. Possibly the only man who could have been. And because he was, the Union survived its greatest test and moved, however imperfectly, towards fulfilling its founding promise that all men are created equal.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.